I think I just really enjoyed learning new things. Doing more work was just like more opportunities to learn. Oh, there's like 50 problems. Like each problem, you probably like learn a little bit more about something completely different. And the way I would just think about it is I would just go try it. And if you fail, that's okay. I don't believe any person on the planet spent 1,000 hours trying to build financial models with AI. Okay, I'm gonna do nothing except for like instruct the AI, and I'm gonna try to build this like LBO model that I would otherwise have to do for work. If you think about it, the bankers are just like, we're just gonna do it by hand. And then if you don't know how to do it, you probably just don't know how to do it. I think that there's probably some kind of big decomposition that you can do where like models can do different parts of this workflow very, very well, but you just don't know because you haven't really like spent the effort to do like the investigation. And I was like, we should go solve this problem. My name is John, co-founder and CEO of Meridian. We're essentially building AI for spreadsheets. We think about like Microsoft Excel as the most distributed programming language in the world. And our goal really is to say, hey, how can we help all of the people that spend a lot of time in spreadsheet software today just move 20 times faster? Prior to that, I spent about 1.5 years at ScaleAI. Before that, I started a couple companies. We've raised slightly more than $15 million. Our seed round was led by Andreessen Horowitz and the General Partnership. And that's kind of where we are. Relatively early, but hopefully we can continue to grow. I think I just really enjoyed learning new things. I think more than anything else, I felt like doing more work was just like more opportunities to learn. Oh, there's like 50 problems. Like each problem, you probably like learn a little bit more about something completely different. And I think Scale was one of those places where if you wanted to learn about a different side of the business, you could go do that. It wasn't like, hey, your job is like X, you can only do X. It was like, your job is X, but like, if you do X and you realize that like Y and Z and A, B, C could also be done, there was the opportunity to essentially say, hey, I'm gonna go learn and like expand my personal sort of like knowledge space and like go do these things. Being willing to sit down and like dig into research, for example, is extremely valuable. I think especially in AI, it becomes relatively easy to get lost in like the execution. Meaning like, oh, okay, we're just gonna do this because like we need to get this thing done. It's actually really valuable to take a step back. It's like, why are we doing this? And then the way you learn is like, you probably just go read all these research papers. Let's just, for example, take like quality of data. Like, what does it mean for data to be high quality versus low quality? What do researchers care about? What specifically makes this data point valuable? Like, I sat down and I went through like so much of our data across so many domains. And I think that's one way to learn.
I met John through mutual friends at Scale, where I had consistently heard that he was really a top 1% performer at Scale. I heard this across the board from many, many people. He didn't allow the confines of Scale, which was already a growth stage, larger startup at that point in time, confine like what he thought was right or not right to do in the business. And so he really took a very first principles approach in thinking about what would the right thing for Scale be. And he was unafraid to voice those opinions to people and then actually move mountains to make them happen.
Why go over to Scale? But I do think like the biggest reason was definitely like, I felt like it was a very unique place to observe AI develop. I think they were very convinced, obviously, that the next wave of like types of like large language models are going to very dramatically change trajectory of what the world looks like. For myself, I think selfishly, I've always wanted to start another company. I think that not knowing what LLMs can do, or like not really immersing yourself in sort of like this rapidly developing ecosystem or technology, or however you want to think about it, is like a mistake. I would be much better off spending like the next 4 years, at least at that time, I thought I was gonna be at Scale for 4 years, really like learning as much as I can about how large language models worked and how it was developing, what was the trajectory of the technology, and like how people are like implementing it, etc. A lot of my job was making sure that like, hey, the data that Scale ultimately produced was valuable. Spent a lot of time thinking about like benchmarks and evaluations. Also spent a lot of time thinking about like, hey, how can we internally like leverage LLMs to make our internal processes more efficient? So I think that for me was like really, really, really interesting. I started using Cursor a lot over the last couple months, where like, you know, last generation of models where like, hey, coding like really felt very real. 0 to 1 actually went from 2 weeks to like 30 minutes or like half a day. I had a moment where I was just like, wow, this thing is like magical. And I want like everyone to like go use it. You know, I was just like, everyone on this team must vibe code. And if you don't know how to vibe code, I feel like you're just gonna be lost or you'll be left behind. But like, ultimately, I think it was just, hey, here's like a new calculator, but it's like it's like a super, super powerful calculator. But I think like more tangibly, because I live in New York, like a lot of my friends work in finance. And I think that like the energy is just like completely not the same, right? Where like you're in San Francisco, like, everyone is like super, super excited about like, okay, here's like the latest vibe coding, like unlock, right? Where like, oh, you have all these like skills that you can leverage for like Claude, for example, or like, here's how you can do these like crazy architectures. It feels like the ground or the number of tools sort of like is increasing like exponentially. And then like you come back to New York and like, that's just like not true. When I talk to like our team, when I talk to like candidates or even like investors, I think a lot about the idea that I don't believe any person on the planet spent 1,000 hours trying to build financial models with AI. I don't think anyone has been sitting down and be like, okay, I'm gonna do nothing except for like instruct the AI, and I'm gonna try to build this like LBO model that I would otherwise have to do for work. If you think about it, the bankers, they're just like, we're just gonna do it by hand. And then if you don't know how to do it, you probably just don't know how to do it. But I think that there's probably some kind of decomposition that you can do where like models can do different parts of this workflow very, very well. But you just don't know because you haven't really like spent the effort to do like the investigation. In contrast to that, when you think about code, I think that a lot of these coding tools are built by the people who use them. So they have a much clearer idea of like what does success look like? What are the different use cases that I care about? I can very clearly articulate where the model is failing. But I do think when you take that and you apply it to a domain where you're like not really an expert, it's pretty easy to say like this model is wrong, but it's pretty difficult to really identify exactly why like the number is not the number that you would expect it to be. But yeah, that's kind of how I thought about it. And I was like, we should go solve this problem. I think if I look back my first job out of college, I think that most salespeople can probably also tell you this, right? Is like, if you don't try to talk to someone, like you will never know. And I think that's something that I've like always done. I would say like, don't be scared to reach out to people. Don't think that like, hey, Satya Nadella will never respond to your email. I mean, if you think that way, he's obviously never going to respond to your email. But if you reach out, you might be surprised. Maybe he'll respond. That's like something that, you know, that I thought was really, really interesting. It's really easy to fall into this narrative that like, oh, these things are like impossible, but you actually don't know. And I think like, you know, most entrepreneurs sort of just have that belief. I think it requires like an enormous amount of like suspension of disbelief, right? Where most people would just be like, you're crazy, but you can actually go in and just be like, I don't know what you're talking about. It sounds totally doable, right? And then you would go try to do it. You also learn by like trying things that you've never tried before. And like, if you fuck up, you fuck up. It's okay. Nothing wrong with that. But at least you know, right? And you can build reps internally. You know, our company as a whole actually promotes and allows people to like try to solve things their own way. And if you fail, it's okay. You just go support them, right? You're like, hey, you tried this thing. Maybe we need to push back the deadline by a few days. And then we'll like find other people to support you, right? Everyone in the company will come support you. And I think you have to build this like environment where it's okay for people to like experiment and not succeed. I mean, I think like obviously you always want to build something that is like a masterpiece, right? Like I think our goal for like starting a company obviously is to like build something that we can be really, really proud of, that we think is going to transform a lot of people's lives, that is going to be like, hey, here's a company that we can look back on in like 5 years, and it has like dramatically impacted the lives of like a lot of people.
As we think about how knowledge work is going to change with AI, there's almost no bigger category of knowledge work than the spreadsheet and Excel worker. And as someone who worked in spreadsheets and Excel as a banker for a brief period of time, and then as a consultant, I could just viscerally understand, one, like why this was an enormous market, and probably in some sense like one of the largest software markets out there. And two, why AI was going to fundamentally change how we did work on spreadsheets. And so I think that Meridian's vision to really augment this form of knowledge workers, similar to how a lot of the coding companies have augmented the work of the developer. I think there's just so much potential here to actually be able to infuse the work done in spreadsheets with meaningful intelligence and automation.
The more time you spend with the technology, the easier it is for you to have an intuition around like what is possible today. And if you do this over like a very sustained period of time, you also build an intuition of what is going to be possible in like 3 months, or what is going to be possible in like 6 months or a year, right? And I think like that in and of itself is extremely valuable. I would just spend as much time as you can playing with it, right? Like, I think it will be advantageous to be one of the people that have spent, let's say you're interested in finance, right? That have spent, like 10,000 hours trying to do finance with AI. I think that prompting is still a very, very valuable skill. Like when you apply to like Y Combinator, they actually tell you that like doing the application in and of itself is super valuable because it forces you to sit down and think through these aspects of your business that maybe is not as well articulated in your head as it is until you write it down. I think that when you explain a task to a large language model in a similar vein where you learn how to be relatively specific about your ask, you learn a lot from that process, right? Like trying to explain to an LLM like what you really want it to do actually gives yourself a lot of clarity around what you really want to do. And I think that part of it is actually very valuable by itself.